our lives. So I grew up in Calcutta, which is a city in eastern India, not too far from the major coal mines of India, which is in the eastern regions of India. So coal is an everyday part of our life. It's not a distant thing that happens in another part, deep in the mines. From coal being used as a domestic fuel in houses, to coal being used in railways. Uh,
Sorry, some of you are unmuted and you're coming through. Check whether you're muted or not. Sorry. Thank you. Go on, Pratik. Apologies.
So coal was a part of an everyday life. And at the same time, there was a duality. When I visited as a young boy, the Indian Museum in coal, what you see is not that domestic dark coal, but coal slabs with fossils of Glossopteris plants inscribed on them. And that is a sanitized version of a coal, the plant from which coal evolves, the same plant that gave us this idea of prehistoric evolution. And that image and that duality of coal has always been important in my growing up and in my understanding about coal, woods, and fossil fuels, that there is a duality in our understanding of coal. Coal, the dark coal or the black coal, is the one that is in the coal mines. The coal mines of eastern India are still burning. The colonial coal mines, the fires that started in the colonial coal mines are burning. And there's a sanitized element about coal leading to prehistoric forests and understanding of a pristine life that exists at the same time. And I find that duality, that distancing, that denialism almost, as an important point to refer to in our history about coal. So, as I started with this discussion, that we are almost at the moment that denialism has to end. It is at our doorstep. It is about that immediacy that is driving us, is driving our symposium. And it is with that moment that I opened this discussion, that what do we do about the future of coal and about our moment of coal. So there, I would just very briefly capture a thread of thinking that I found in the various talks. I would not refer to each talk in any detail because I think that would take up too much of time, and I don't want to speak for too long. But so one of the key themes that came up is that it is actually timber and wood that fueled colonialism. And that is in a way surprising, but in a way it is not, because it is the forest lands, the clearing of forest lands that played a critical part of colonialism and colonial fuel economy. But what it also suggests is whether it's coal or it is wood, there's a key link, and that is this symposium's contribution in a major way between carbonization and colonialism. So there's a key link, whether it's wood or coal, there's a key link between what we understand today as carbonization and historical colonialism. So any discussion from now on, let's hope, about carbonization has to engage with colonialism. And so we cannot deny, again, colonialism out of carbonization. So that denial has to end, in my opinion. The second, from that moment of wood, we see the link between plantation economies developing in Australia, India, Caribbean, and the clearing of forests and new plantation economy appearing, which some of these papers highlighted, how there was a transcultural link and ecological plantation ecology developing over an empire in the 19th century, from the 18th century. That was important. And that transcultural link about fossil fuel is critical to think in today's moment, when we know that fossil fuel companies of India are playing a major role in fossil fuel economies in Australia. So that transculturalism of colonial transculturalism is present in our everyday lives today. I think the main point I'm making is it is our doorstep moment in our history. And that story about wood and plantation brings us to the story of the link between fossil fuel and ethnology of people. Because in India, Africa, and in Australia, we see the similarities of Aboriginal people being driven away from their resources, from their land, in the search of forests, in the search of coal mines, and that history is key to our history of coal. So one of the important points that I would like to make is how can we write humans back into the history of coal? Because colonial ethnology, and that's something I have researched in my work, is born out of moments of clearing of colonial forests and creating of colonial mines. So the study of Aboriginal populations in India was the moment when colonialism was encroaching onto forest lands or mining regions. That is when they encountered what they call forest people or hill people. And that is the birth of colonial ethnology. So we cannot write people or humans out of histories of coal. That brings me, thankfully, to the final point that I wanted to raise and discuss, is what is the future of coal? Where do we go from there? So if carbonization and colonialism are closely linked, how do we decolonize coal? How do we is it only about decarbonization, or is it about appreciating and understanding other parallel, important relationships between our lives and nature? So do we have to reevaluate the entire relationship about nature and human society that colonialism kind of captures in a very critical moment? So how do we decolonize the history of coal is my final question to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pratik. Who would like to join in? There's a lot there, and I think this notion that that to decarbonize we have to decolonize coal historically as well. I mean, you say that too, that to understand a roadmap out of carbonization, we have to understand historically the roadmap in to inform how we get out of it. But I like what you said there, Pratik, quite specifically. How do we decolonize coal? Any thoughts? Anyone can jump in, by the way.
This seems a little bit in my space,
Yeah.
in terms of the idea of decolonizing place and peoples. So I think it's a really challenging question to universalize the idea of decolonizing coal, because the issue with colonization is that it's so contingent, and I mean we want to see the large engine at work, and that's I really love this talking in a very meta sense about colonialism, colonization, but then ultimately both the coal is place situated in terms of bringing it out of the ground and then burning it at some point, or the timber for that matter. And also if we're talking about decolonizing as a methodology, then it is about that idea of hearing voices in a place where they have been erased and they were Indigenous voices, and then they're about either timber or coal as connected with colonization. So yeah, I mean, I think that's it's a really important kind of core mission around mission being not the exactly right word I would have wanted to come to mind at that point, but a purpose around what it is that we'd like to proceed to do. And but just the final thing I would say is it was really intriguing to undertake that for one place and one Indigenous clan in the paper that I have worked on for this presentation. And then what I think we need to discuss is that how can you make that larger? Because the contingency does stand between us and the possibility of a kind of deeply effective decolonization. But perhaps what we end up doing is going to the places, as you say. So Kolkata has this coal history that would indicate if we're going to choose another place, that would be a great place to start too. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, I think so. can I just ask Pratik, unless you want to respond? I just wanted to bring Joanna in here because of her paper and the way she does, in fact, position, you know, the chains of agency with coal globally between, and in a very fine granular way, if you like, shows that the Manchester British magnates, the cotton and textile magnates, imposed these very discriminatory tariffs and protection measures on Indian cotton producers so that they weren't able to have access to those technologies. And I think that's actually a really interesting, you know, the way Andreas's paper, that not many of you will have had time to see, also talks about the way the British suppressed the production chains in the Middle East and along the Niger Delta, so that they weren't just extracting, you know, they were profoundly suppressing industry in the places where they were going to compete. Does that sound right, Joanna?
Yeah, I watched Andreas's presentation this morning, and I thought it was very interesting because I'm essentially drawing the differences between fossil fueled infrastructure and transport infrastructure, and actually fossil fueled industrial development. And if we speak of the fossil economy being kind of diffused to the colonies via the mechanism of colonialism, then we tend to mean kind of the uptake of industrial and mechanized development and economic development. But actually what we see here is that, interestingly, as Andreas' mom also shows, that steam technology in the form of infrastructure and steamboats and railways was actually used to prevent the uptake of something like the fossil economy in, for example, the case of India. Obviously, that's not the same everywhere, and it took different forms in different contexts. But in India, we clearly see that, for example, the railways that were one of the main projects of the British cotton magnates at the time, and for which they lobbied the British government of India for a number of years, was actually designed in a way to promote an extractive agricultural economy rather than industrial fossil fuel development. Yeah. So, and I think that kind of complicates our understanding of the relationship between coal and colonialism, because, you know, perhaps, I mean, that wasn't really at the center of my argument, but a hypothesis would be that perhaps fossil fueled industrial development in the case of India was only really taken up with post-colonial, in post-colonial states.
So it's a different kind of imposition almost to what Andreas is talking about. It's an imposition and a repression too, isn't it? Ruth, did you find that in your arboreal energy, in the biosteam of eucalypt plantations in the Nilgiri in southern India? Also a kind of suppression of Indian industry, as well as imposition of fossil, you know, eucalypt colonies?
Not so much, pardon me, perhaps a suppression of more indigenous cultivation methods rather than industry, but that might have been just because of where I was looking, and the issue that was, I suppose, at hand there was a concern about not enough timber, and given that the British perspective of how the local peoples in the hills peoples, as Pratik says, was sort of shifting agriculture and often burning the land, that was seen as quite you know, undesirable basically for British eyes. So in that way, I suppose there was some suppression going on, and their issue there was trying to really ensure that there was a renewable resource, really, in the kind of temporal framing, or you know, that availability would be there when they needed it. Mainly because the coal wasn't in the vicinity, and it's awfully difficult to get coal up to the top of the Nilgiris just because of the terrain. It's really tricky, still tricky now, trying to do it in a car, let alone back then. So yeah, it's interesting just to see even within sort of the Madras presidency, even that kind of diversity of landscape and resources affecting the kinds of strategies or decisions that could be made around energy and development, for want of a better word.
Mm.
I think, no, sorry, I just wanted to comment on a slightly different but related point of why coal appears such a powerful metaphor and for why. And I remember one point that on Bharat's paper made is about we're almost an age behind. So what appears to be the age of coal was very much the age of wood, and what appears to be the age of oil is very much the age of coal. So we are almost catching up in that. And the point on makes is about, it's about not one replacing the other, it's about the intensification of
each.
that. So we need to understand that we're almost catching up on that history of fossil fuel, that it is that intensification. And another interesting point about why coal appears so powerful in the 19th century is that there's a rhetoric about coal in 19th century British imperialism. Whether that is a reality or not is a different point. And I remember Roderick Murchison, who is the director of the Geological Survey, made this very clear statement that coal is the meter of power of modern nations, and that is a rhetoric, and that kind of captures 19th century as a coal movement, but as on and other papers have said, it's actually a timber movement. So I think that overlapping of history of fuels, almost a strata building, is a critical way to thinking about fossil fuel histories.
Yeah, indeed. And perhaps I'll throw to you on, because it seems that your intervention in perceptions of oil in the Middle East is a kind of replay of the narrative, and it's a very nationalist narrative in Australia about coal, that we were digging it up and exporting it in huge tonnages from the get-go, when actually we were clear felling our forests like there was no tomorrow. And so it's sort of almost a seesaw thing. And so that whole notion that you say on about transition not being a helpful concept, when in fact these new motive powers rather than energy regimes actually intensified and animated animal power, human power, all these other things sort of came up. Nancy, you mentioned whale oil. Andreas talks about palm oil. So we actually sort of see this not a transition at all. Can you speak to that on?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I absolutely agree, Liz and Pratik, that this entanglement of energy sources should not be seen as a story of transition, and maybe not even as a story of energy regimes, but rather as one of intensification. And I think that the entanglement of fossil energy and sustainable solar energies, be they wood or hydropower or wind, has a lot to do with the entanglement of the metropole and the colonies. So to revisit the previous question about suppression and underdevelopment, perhaps suppression and underdevelopment are less useful than simply to suggest that the globalization of the Industrial Revolution and of the steam engine happened in different ways. So industrialization in the British Isles was organized around the assembly line, and industrialization in the Middle East, and so, for example, in Egypt, that Andreas also mentioned, was an agrarian industrialization where coal was critical to the adoption of long staple cotton, of other cash crops via irrigation pumps. You cannot irrigate your cotton fields without perennial irrigation, which the annual inundation of the Nile does not provide. So you need coal-fire pumps to facilitate this. And if that is the case, then I think the problem of decolonizing coal or decolonizing carbonization is messier and trickier, because agents in the colonies Andreas, for example, mentions Muhammad Ali Pasha, or I would call him Mehmet Ali Pasha in his Ottoman name, was considered by the British authorities as the biggest steam enthusiast. And this is true for Parsis in Bombay, it's true for the Ottoman Sultan. There was a game of catching up that is still around today. So one trajectory of decolonizing fossil fuels is in this framing of the global South would catch up and then would kind of increase its economy, would increase its reliance on even on coal, in the case of India, for example, until such moment that that the global parity is reached, and only from which point onwards can we think about decarbonization. And I think this is a very tragic and difficult position, which is very much the legacy of how 19th century carbonization unfolded.
I don't want to sort of move away from wood before perhaps calling on you, Susan, because it's really such a revelatory presentation that you give. It completely upends that whole coal narrative about either as a metaphor pratique or as a kind of nationalist notion of industry. Can you talk a little bit about that, Susan?
Thanks, Liz. I suppose listening to Pratik and On and Joanna talk and Julie's point about place, yeah, I think what the thought of wood does is it does make it more complex, but it also, as an archaeologist, makes me think about the materiality of coal and what is it about coal that can accomplish things that might be different to what other forms of power do. And you need to disentangle the fuel from the power, and I think that's very important. But what Andreas's talk, which I also managed to listen to at least part of, he's talking about the use of steamboats as a military force and how effective they were. And the reason that they would have been effective is because steam, not coal, steam allows them to move much more flexibly and get up the rivers and so on. But that is steam, that is the motive power, it's not the fuel. What On talked about with wood in Egypt was there was no wood. So if you want to have steam, you have to have coal. So there's, and that's the same when you see in India, Ruth talks about them planting the plantations because they wanted the fuel, they wanted the wood. And so it's, yeah, we can think about what are they actually after? What is it that is the pointy end of colonization in these different places? And how are these ends being achieved? So
that's really important, Susan. So materiality of coal and the importance of disentangling fuel power from fuel is what you're saying. Yeah. So there's quite a few of you that aren't presenters. Would anybody from the audience like to join in and have some discussion or anything? Maybe people.
Could I just jump in on the coattails behind Susan before we go to others? So it seems like perhaps just to kind of try to summarize what people are saying, not to make a new point, but that it's the intensification of energy use, and that timber becomes like a gateway drug. We can have the steam engines without the coal, but then we've got the whole apparatus. We've got a new familiarity with the reliability of steam-fueled navigation, for example, and of railways. And then once the economies start to tip so that it is more economical to have coal instead of wood, we're there. We can, it's barely a transition. It's just, a different supply chain perhaps, but the technology that's being used to achieve the end is already in place.
Yeah, I don't know, Nancy. I'm just going to, I'm thinking, about Victoria, where once we started using the coal, it wasn't for steam, it was for electricity. And that is the 20th century thing. So if you think of, well, what do the different fuels do, and or the different power sources, electricity is clean, gas is clean, gas in your kitchen as a fuel is clean compared to wood or to coal, and is very portable. So it's still that, I think you're right about the infrastructure and switching over to things, but it's still complicated.
Yes, okay. I'll totally accept that there's not going to be one overall answer. There's going to be particularities. And I did have a look at the New South Wales railway system, and they did make the change to coal in the early 1860s. So they're different stories, even between the Australian colonies.
Yeah, coal is, happening from 1797 in Australia, but nothing like as we might have expected from that nationalist narrative of, coal being the second largest export after wool and blah, blah, blah. But I guess the other thing to remember there is whether there's a difference of kind of land grabbing in deforestation as there might be with coal exploration and extraction and rail lines and infrastructure and so on. I mean, you make an important point on about really the coal posts that the British established throughout the Middle East were absolutely about an expansionist, imperialist program of land grabbing. But I see Joanna's hand is up.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I just wanted to come in because I didn't really research wood in India, but when looking at the railways, I came across the fact that the railways early on were actually largely powered by wood. And I think maybe there's also a parallel between just two aims, like finding a fuel, but then on the other hand, also clearing the land. So actually in India, the railways were key to accessing the interior and the markets in the interior, and actually carrying the cotton, the raw cotton, to the ports, because that wasn't really, to that extent, wasn't possible before. And seasonality was really important. You had monsoons that would make it really difficult to travel on the roads and also on the rivers. So I think here perhaps to kind of the colonial, to extend colonial power over the colony was also a really important aim in using using wood as a fuel. And I think perhaps Susan also makes that point, if I remember correctly.
Sorry, I ducked off because I remembered Judy Brett's excellent quarterly essay, which is about how the mining industry took over the national conversation. And that's distinguishing, again, mining from coal, from steam. There's lots of different things going on.
Thanks, Susan. Justin, I see your hand is up. Hello.
Thank you. Hello there.
Welcome.
From University of Sussex in the UK.
Hi.
And thank you to all the presenters. I find this absolutely fascinating discussion, and I'm learning a lot. And my question really is a kind of free, open question to the presenters about what kind of overall theoretical framework do we need or do you use to conceptualize this process? Because it's very striking to me that we're talking about, on the one hand, the globalization of a particular historical form of human society, industrial society, capitalism, whatever, extractivism. On the other hand, we're talking about how it's taking very different forms in different places. And then there are all these overlaps between different fuel types and so on, complicating simplistic notions of transition. And there are also interactions between completely different sort of levels of activity, between the social and the ecological, for example. So now, to me, that says an intellectual framework like the idea of uneven and combined development would be a great way of bringing all this together and conceptualizing it as a historical process. But I'm interested to hear from the speakers, because what you're doing conjures up this image of an overall process. What is that overall process and how do we conceptualize it? Sorry, that wasn't supposed to be a trick question. I just
go for it.
Know what perspectives people are bringing to bear on this.
Did you want to respond on and then Pratik?
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question, and especially pertinent because the combustion of coal ends up in creating a global heating or global warming problem that requires us to think of methodologies that are both local and global. Global historians in recent years are very active in connecting various spheres of action, ecological, capitalism, social, and others, and cultural. They, for example, point away from stressing global connectivity towards stressing global integration. That happens unevenly but simultaneously, and that requires attending to both the homogenizing and collective, but also to the difference. So that is one avenue that might be interesting to pursue.
Pratik, did you want to add to that?
I'll try. Thanks, Justin, for and I think this is the kind of session to have these kind of questions because we are here to. And I think the 2 points that I can make. One is to see how colonialism provided a new intensification of relationship with nature and transformations of nature into resource process, whether that's wood, coal, timber, coal, or oil. But that is, I think, a key point to be made into that relationship. The other point is slightly on the other side. And one of the things I've struggled with in historiography and writing is we tend to look at fossil fuel, coal, or even any kind of resources from the top. It's a very structural view. It's a very structural view of what's happening, and I wonder if there is a distancing in doing that. And I wonder if we can write what I would call a subaltern history of coal. And the elements of that are present in every paper. And can I just bring that up? That there's a lot of writing in India is that how coal miners' lives changed, mining, how new coal cults or goddesses appeared as the way of protecting them from the mining industries. So can we write a history of coal from below, not history of coal from a structural point of view of major economic changes, mining industries? So I think one of the processes of decolonizing coal can be about humanizing coal, not humanizing in a positive sense, but making or making it or writing it as it is in our people's everyday lives, that how people live with even now. And if you travel in eastern parts of India, that would be hitting your eyes and senses very closely. So I think, is it possible to write a subaltern history of coal? Is my plea.
Thanks, Pratik. That seems to confirm what Julie was saying before about localizing it and understanding those exact sort of frontier interactions between, in Julie's case, the Awakabal, who were using coal in their fires, who had a mythic relationship, a cosmology and an ontology of coal too. And then there's what might happen in terms of, once you have the infrastructure introduced, what might happen with dislocation, fragmentation of family, and then the very important thing, of course, is labour and labour regimes and how they're racialised. But I see Mark has his hand up. Hi, Mark.
Hello, everyone. Thanks. It has been absolutely fascinating. Before I begin, Bill King, what's the name of the cat? Oh, and never mind. I should continue. I wanted to respond. Sorry,
Bert
the cat.
Bert's very keen computer cat.
We have 3 of those. I wanted to come back to something Pratik just said, and also a question that floated around earlier around power. And Pratik's question or suggestion was writing histories of coal or other resources from below. And there's a book that I presume many people on the call are familiar with, but maybe some aren't, by John Gaventa, called, I believe it's called Power and Powerlessness. It's from about 35 years ago. I'll put it in the chat. And it's an ethnography of, I want to say, West Virginia coal miners in the 1940s onwards. And he uses a sort of a Gramscian sense of the creations of common sense and the way that the workers don't really understand that the crucial decisions are being made in the metropole, not by their immediate direct managers. So I would suggest that a lot of this work has perhaps already been done, but it hasn't been looked at again, synthesized using some of the new conceptions that we're hearing from people like On and Susan and everyone else. So there may not be, it may just be a question of, dare I say, excavation of, but hopefully not extraction of existing academic work. And now I will shut up. Oh, final thing is I've been live tweeting this on the Environmental Politics Twitter account, and I'll put both the Gaventa thing and the Environmental Politics address in the chat.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. And I guess it's that thing about like the Appalachian, you know, we could do a lot of excavation into labour history and revive and resuscitate all the work that was done around that. It appears a lot in Andreas's Fossil Capital much earlier accounts of labour history and focused on labour history rather than resource extraction. So there's quite a few hands up here. Casey, will we go to you next, and then Jane Toner?
Thanks, Liz, and thanks all for fascinating discussion and fascinating papers. It's really wonderful to sit and listen to both the papers and your discussion. Just want to pick up on some of those ideas about excavating and thinking about the dailiness of coal use or energy use, picking up Susan's kind of desire to distinguish between the material and the power and labour, and reminding us that this is also a very gendered discussion when we're thinking about who is using what power and what kinds of power. And if we think about electricity, for example, and the use of power in the home, we're talking about women using and picking up electrical goods because they're labour-saving devices, and thus the home becomes such an important locus of electricity consumption, which also then is really important in terms of giving women a way out of domestic, you know, the burden of domestic labour. So Liz, the issue of labour is both one of who's mining the coal,
and who's consuming.
And who's consuming, and you know, there's some I think there's really interesting things that work to be done there in that space as well. The other thing I was thinking about in the discussion about the intensification of fossil fuel use and the ways in which this is layered, I'm really struck at the moment in Australia, the discourse, and I think T's picked this up about gas and using gas as a kind of transition fuel away from coal and eventually into clean hydrogen. But there's absolutely no discussion at all about questioning consumption of power but what there is an absolute assumption that it will just continue to increase, and we've just got to find cleaner ways and technological solutions to the problem, rather than thinking about how, as On says, we got into the problem in the first place.
Yeah, and Susan, you make that point very explicitly at the end of your paper. This is about consumption. it's about living at a standard that is way beyond planetary kind of means and a capacity for the biome to absorb. Jane, hi.
Hi, Liz. Hi, everyone. I've been hesitating to step in or say something because I've come late to this and I haven't watched the presentations, but it's a really fascinating discussion. I'm an architect and a regenerative design consultant, and I've been teaching architecture students this afternoon about creating better built environments that use less energy. But the approach that we often take is, the idea of that mechanistic worldview, which I think is something that accompanied colonialists to new places. So they took the same view as the place that they came from and didn't, their adaptation to place occurred on a resource level and a physical level perhaps, but not adaptation of thinking, the thinking process. So my analogy was going to be as like a cane toad arrives in Australia and just does what a cane toad is programmed to do. That's what colonialists have done. It's like, yes, we need resources. Here they are, just everything else is subsumed, if that's the right word, and consumed.
Yeah, and expendable.
Yeah, in that same mindset. So yeah, it's that mechanistic worldview and a failure to understand systems.
Do you mean natural systems, Jane?
No, I mean, yeah, well, natural systems and systems thinking. So, the connection of, the ecosystem. What happens if we chop down all of the trees and burn them up? Oh, well, there's nothing to produce oxygen for us to breathe. Just not thinking it through, because we colonialists, we were thinking on that very narrow scale of where it was that we came from.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I guess it kind of raises that thing about the hand in glove thing of land, of deforestation and dispossession, which I think is a really important question that needs to be really carefully examined. I see your hand up, Julie.
Thanks, Liz. I just really enjoying the discussion. I just have a couple of points leading from the earlier points about labour. This is definitely a critical area, and I put a comment in the chat which was about some work that I've yet to take a look at, but it came up in a study that I've just finished about trying to understand whether there can be intersections between environmental history and labour history. And so Thomas Andrews' book, Killing for Coal, is one that we probably should put on a reading list if that's something that kind of comes out of this discussion. And the other thing is I'm really excited to hear talk of systems thinking. I think of this as relational history, which is not what I've called it until I started reading Jason Moore's work on the capitalocene, which it was the environmental history reviewer for this piece I'm doing on the relationship between environmental and labour historians. It was that reviewer who pushed me towards more, for which I'm very grateful. And the reason that it works, and just coming into what it is that we're saying here about the idea of supply chains and value chains, and Justin's point about methodology, is the way that I usually work is I work around a commodity. So what I'm mostly known for is understanding the role of wine in history, but yes, I drink some pretty magnificent wine, but mostly what I actually do is try and fit it into understanding other worlds. So as a tool for civilization, and also how there are how Indigenous people and working class people and so on have been erased from wine and its role. And what that's led me to is this type of relational history where I have to read across economic history, social history, cultural history, environmental history, and draw it together. And I'm just, what I would finally say about that is, again, speaking to Justin's point about methodology, the way that it can work, because we're talking about multiple scales and where do they intersect and all sorts of cross-disciplinary currents. Where it can work is we can, what I certainly do is work with a type of history of a complex. So who's the nice young man who does the work on meat and cattle? One of you will know. Ruth will know. Hay will know. So he talks about the beef cattle complex. I talk about the grape wine complex. We don't quite have the same thing that fits here with coal and energy and wood and so on, but there are ways using transnational methodologies and webs and networks following processes historically that does allow us to reveal something larger using interdisciplinary methods. It helps if there are many people doing that rather than one person trying to follow a trail. But I think there are certainly already some examples of how we can do that, because we're talking about both the commodity and the human intentions around it, and then the layers of those other forms of history inside of it.
Excellent, Julie. Those are great observations. So system thinking and relational history, so actually connecting all of these layers together. And they have sort of been done in a kind of fragmented way until now. And maybe decolonizing coal, it could be the impetus to actually integrate them and think them together better. Mark, is your hand the old hand or is that a new hand? It's the old hand.
Yeah, sorry about that, but just to, while I've got your attention, Anna sings Mushroom at the End of the World, and I'll take my hand down.
Okay, thank you. Fantastic. So T Mitchell, you left a comment that I actually want to return to in the last few moments, and then finish with Pratik's, any thoughts from Pratik. I just think perhaps we should to bring it into the present and talk a little bit about gas. And you mentioned, T, what's going on in the Northern Territory and gas exploration and the new kind of gas-led discovery from the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about that, T, in the ways that it might connect to some of these themes?
Sure. I mean, I'm just an interested member of the public, so not an expert. But it just struck me as an example of intensification where a kind of well-worn narrative, nationalist narrative around coal was kind of being applied in the Northern Territory, supposedly as a solution to the political challenge from the perspective of the Conservatives here in Australia, and the kind of pressure to do something on climate change. But then as also having a kind of representing a kind of combination of the larger footprint in terms of wood and the kind of expansionist nature of that kind of modality, but also the extractive nature of coal in the sense of it, its nature as a fossil fuel. Just because gas, spreads out over vast kind of areas of land. And also I think the point that I was making as well is that, the colonization really is the business of the Australian state. That's what it is. It's what it does. It's kind of the MO. And so from that perspective, it also achieves certain ends in the Northern Territory where Aboriginal people make up a proportionally large amount of the population. And also, are living on country. So in terms of the work of the government in erasing culture and breaking those links to country, it also achieves those ends. So it just struck me as a kind of synergy of a few of those points.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's rinse and repeat, isn't it, really? I should mention that T isn't just an interested party. T is is in fact Australia's first climate journalist when he was writing for New Matilda, and did an extraordinary job exposing some of the corruption around around the carbon barons in Australia. So we have only 2 minutes left. We can stay and chat if you like. Pratik does have to go, so I'm now going to throw over to him because he only has 2 minutes. What do you think, Pratik? Any thoughts? Any final thoughts?
I mean, I've thought some thoughts, but they are not final thoughts, hopefully, and will not be final thoughts. I was just reflecting on, and because this has changed all our views about writing about coal or fossil fuel, and I was reflecting on what is the future history of coal.
Yeah.
And I have a few thoughts, and I'm drawing from each of your paper in imagining a future history of coal, and it's from the intensification. It's about the systems that Julie talked about. It's about archaeology, or material artifacts. And I feel that we might have to move away from coal and adopt a more wider approach of history, which is where environmental history is engaged with labor history, is engaged with ethnology, fuel, power. So the only way, see, we are not going to decolonize or decarbonize the world. And what we can write is a new history. All we can do as historians is write new histories. So I think the future history of coal has to be an integrated history of various forms of understanding nature, relationships, and artifacts of nature. And I'm not making it too broad, but we can keep coal at the heart and then say that to understand what coal is, we have to integrate a wider history about environmental history, economic history, subaltern histories, and system history. So I think the future history of coal, in my opinion, I will leave that thought with you, has to be that connected history.
And a little bit, as Susan was saying, that it has to be a history of fuel.
Yes.
Yeah, and not the way they transition from one to the other, but the way they animate and intensify each other. What do you think?
The very intensification throws away the very intensification throws away this one center, whole center history, because we have to think in wider scales, and that wider scale allows you or needs you to have this wider approaches, coal, wood, oil, and what is the wider history around those artifacts. So I think that is the message, that we need wider approaches in understanding even coal.
Does that fit with your thinking on?
Well, it pushes it forces me to expand my thinking, I think, because my project or the book I just published, it was an attempt to move away from energy and to move away from fuel and to attend to the materiality and sociality and cultural context of coal. And I thought that we needed to muzzle and to silence the abstractions of energy and of thinking only of fossil fuels as fuels, to better excavate and explicate what coal does in the world.
Yeah.
But perhaps this is not enough either, and perhaps we need to move as a pendulum between energy, fuel, coal, things that coal animates and translates to and intensifies. So I think moving back and forth, a restless history rather than finding one clear solution would I think synthesize nicely Pratik and my vision.
Yeah, I like that. A restless, maybe, and even an energized history. Okay, well, people have got other commitments, and so I'm going to have to, I'm a few minutes over already, I'm going to have to close the discussion, but I want to thank particularly the presenters who have, these papers are quite remarkable for those of you that have joined us and hadn't had time to look at them. They really are absolutely revelatory and inspiring, and I do think they do point to a new way of doing you know, all kinds of histories that are part of a system, and as you say, Julie, a relational history. So this has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you all for contributing and for coming, and be in touch, because there is more on the horizon, not just the pall from carbon. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, for bringing us all together. Great work.
Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks, Liz.